but I'm glad to be with you now. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Great. Great. Just so you guys know, I'm already recording the session here, okay?
Great.
Great, great to know. Well, I'm also amazed, Bobby, with your work here and the impact and everything. And we are, of course, we're gonna learn together. We're gonna exchange right with each other. One of the biggest challenges of the Open Innovation VR movement, I like it to call it a movement, not an organization or something like this, because it really gives the real ideal of being even more organic. Is really, how because we have a great magnetism. We attract a lot of people, and people we work for the purpose of fomenting and strengthening the open innovation ecosystem in Brazil, which is a purpose that really moves people, right? And that's why people get together and they start, organically, they organize themselves. We organize ourselves, right? And start doing events and actions to strengthen and foment the Brazilian open innovation ecosystem. But it is a huge challenge. How do we, have a systemic view of everything? How do we cluster groups, and how do we manage this? And this is something that I want to learn and hear a little from you and your work.
I'd be happy to share, and I'll address a few dimensions of that in sequence. And if I missed one vector of the question, we can return to it. But I think that one way to describe it is the frame of social innovation density proportionate to the sustainable development goals and beyond that we wish to achieve, and the social innovation gaps in the world that exists compared to those social innovation densities. And if we speak about that, then we speak about the scale of social innovation at the scale of our challenges, at the scale of our root problems, at the scale of our prevention gaps and our prevention goals. And that's a meta frame that is feasible at the realm of collaboration between the social innovation community and all other stakeholders. So there are different constituencies of social change that come together. One set of our collaborators are motivated by the term service learning and the theory of service learning, which is to say when you achieve at least as efficient a learning as you would in traditional instruction, but are also achieving an impact in the community. And we focus service learning on social innovation so that we have leverage for impact. And that allows us to get the data scientists who are early career professionals, or human resource business partners who are early career professionals, to provide, or project managers who are early career professionals, to collaborate in a service learning frame. But service learning is only one part of what's needed. The book Steven Weber wrote called The Success of Open Source, which I would suggest as worthwhile reading for anyone interested in open innovation, is
Writing that down.
is an economics analysis of how Linux was produced on an hour per hour efficiency greater than Microsoft employees during the period of Linux's original rise. And so the volunteering can be extremely efficient. And the differences between centralized top-down command and control and Linux were that people could pick a problem that they loved and choose what they wanted to work on and have a fluidity of the labor to the dimension of the problem. So we emulate the same with CrowdDoing, and Steven Weber identifies, this has potential across all the other fields other than computer science. And we've said, yes, we're running in that direction of impact potential. So what we say is that all the fields can leverage the principles that Steven Weber identified in that book. One of them is micro leadership. Another is service learning. Another is demonstration of mastery. Another is collaboration across fields. Now, in the case of the way we approach that, we identified that micro leadership is not a micro volunteering. It's not micro collaboration or micro pro bono. It's a role over an extended period of time in which someone allows their creativity and their empirical knowledge to integrate over time in collaboration with others and connect their work and their service learning and their collaboration and their creative efforts and all of these dimensions of skill to the whole. And so it's not just ephemeral role. It's something where they would name it as an identity for themselves. Sometimes they do so on LinkedIn publicly. Sometimes they do so privately, but they sign a waiver with us that says they're volunteering a certain number of hours per week or per month or per quarter, and they can change it at any time. And we then say, what are their service learning goals and what are their impact goals? What global issue do they care about? And then we've deployed them across 600 conference calls and dozens of projects where we've connected them to a systems change gap at a research and practice level.
Very interesting.
Very nice. Yeah, that's amazing. And Bobby, how do you overcome the challenge of specific knowledge and multidisciplinary teams? Because sometimes for innovation, we know that there is this challenge on balancing knowledge versus diversity. How do you balance that out?
Well, this brings us into a part of this that I'll have to explain a bit of knowledge theory and information theory. But if that's okay, I can share a bit of context here. So,
Sure, go ahead.
There's a wonderful book by Dominique Faure on the economics of knowledge. And if you see Dominique Faure's work in the history of theory of knowledge, Dominique Faure is the protege of John Seeley Brown's co-author, and John Seeley Brown wrote The Social Life of Information and On an Exponential Culture of Learning. And these are two related frames, on an Exponential Culture of Learning and Dominique Faure's Economics of Knowledge. And if you connect these two together, so what you learn from economics of knowledge is that the liquidity premium of tacit information grows exponentially as all other knowledge becomes commoditized or Googleable. Everything that is Googleable is commoditized information. Everything that is tacit knowledge is scarce. Now, if you look at where the study of the economics of knowledge intersects inequality, what you see is that tacit knowledge concentrations are one of the most dramatic causes of inequality, because it's only limited networks that have tacit knowledge, because tacit knowledge you need to have trust with enough for a conversation with or a lunch with or a relationship with, and it doesn't automatically release itself in the Google wild. It's just accessible only through humans. And that has allowed, because the liquidity premium of tacit information grows exponentially compared to all other information, it has created this context of knowledge asymmetry in global city capitals, and this is part of a global challenge. Now, the point of this in terms of social innovation is if you connect this to the Leibniz challenge. So Leibniz was the last person in Europe to be able to teach every course taught in Europe in that time. So all fields taught at all universities in Europe, Leibniz could teach several hundred years ago. No one since can teach all the courses, can master all the courses, and so there's an underlying scarcity. Now, the scarcity is actually addressable because if you have each social innovation as a center point and identify every field that intersects it, that's 100 people plus that intersect any social innovation I've ever met. You know, that's why we say every organization on the planet, every social innovation adopter has a 2 order of magnitude micro leadership role diversification gap. They need to create 100 times more roles for stakeholders to participate in their micro social movement in support of the social innovation. And that allows us to address the Leibniz challenge. No one can know all the fields. And if you're a social entrepreneur, you're going to be missing 95% of the fields that indirectly intersect your work. Maybe if you're lucky, you're master of 50% of the fields that directly intersect your work. But the point is that you're never going to have that level of knowledge dominance vis-a-vis a social innovation as a Leibniz. unless you leverage the tacit knowledge networks. So how do you leverage the tacit knowledge networks? That's on a New Culture of Learning, the John Seeley Brown book. You can see it's basically creating a radical agency through iteration, through data self-awareness, data collaborative awareness, peer support, and bonding social capital within adventure teams. So effectively, in the social innovation movement, we've had a conflation often of bonding versus bridging social capital. And what we need the bonding social capital for is to get people into micro leadership roles over time. That's a bonding kind of structure. What we need the bridging social capital for is for, say, Canovo to social innovation replicate. Canovo replicates one social innovation a year from the rest of the world to Latin America. They bridge to a social innovation on the other side of the world. Or I bridge to someone who connects this and that wonderful thing together, and that's a bridging social capital role. And for social innovation, what we need is effectively bonding social capital among the 100 fields that connect any social innovation gap in society in order to have impact potential be realizable proportionate to social innovation theoretical impact potential.
Great, great. I imagine that's exactly what we are doing now, right? Connecting the bonds here of the knowledge across. And talking a little bit more about the how, Bobby, do you use specific tools, or do you think it's less about the tools, it's more about the discipline and about how do you keep people engaged to share the knowledge and to have meaningful impact? Because it's not just sharing knowledge, but working together towards impact, right?
So the way to think about the tools is it's proportionate to the intra-disciplinary professional norms. So if we work with project managers and don't leverage the parts that are useful from existing project management process, then they get frustrated because we're too discontinuous. Now, we don't say that we want to use everything from the expectations of each of these traditions, because project management as a field should consider the interests of stakeholders and not just perception management of stakeholders, and we don't want to just reuse the fields and the tools. But where the tools from startup world can be reused, we often have adopted. We have day-to-day used Google Drive and Google Meet, and we've used Slack for 15,000 messages, for example, within our medicinal foods team. We've had about 30 Trello boards that we've used to coordinate on some other teams in terms of Kanban and wish lists. And we've, within the data science and machine learning team, we've had definitely a set of code on Bitbucket that we've used, and created some maps of reusable libraries from different parts of the open source community that are connectable to the project, and scrapers and spiders that can be reused for the sake of public health. This is our medicinal food citizen science to understand sleep, stress, and anxiety in terms of what foods and herbs can be beneficial for people to address that, and in what combinations, and with what chance of effectiveness, and how can we change the evidence base of medicinal foods to reach parity with the pharmaceutical world. So that's one set of tools that, in a context of a team, we use. I mean, we use a lot of Excel in the financial modeling. Our financial modeling collaboration, in the case of biophilia, have y'all heard the term biophilia?
No. Have you?
Biophilia is love of plants, love of nature, and it turns out it pays for itself. So this is an example that I'll walk through. So if you see Alexander, have you ever seen a vertical garden?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's what we're talking about with plant walls. It's one way,
especially in the cities, right?
Yes, exactly. So what we did is a simulation for any hospital to say, could they become covered with plant walls, 3% of all the square footage across the hospital, and allow 90 minutes a day of time with plants for doctors, nurses, and patients. And we've been able to, 5 days a week, and we've been able to simulate that prevents 500 deaths over 20 years and 5,000 major medical events through reduction of opioid addiction, reduction of painkiller use, reduction of heart attack, stroke, and cancer and asthma, and medical mistakes being one of the largest financial parts of that. But the point is that that's been 18 months of spreadsheets and interdisciplinary resource, and in that case, 95% of any part of our model does not get contained in any one source in the world. So in other words, each of the different studies of this before had looked at this outcome or looked at that outcome. They had never woven together all those dimensions. And so we've been able to show that the plant walls pay for themselves in 10 months in the hospital because all those outcomes come together. And so we think that's an example of this disciplinary fracturing where we don't know the impact potential of a social innovation because we haven't looked at it in the way that you can, which is each module of it in terms of the evidence of effectiveness of that dimension over time and related contexts, and then integrating that together. There is WISIP, if you all look at the Washington State Institute for Public Policy Cost Effectiveness, but that's only for social interventions. What we need is the same mindset of impact potential analysis for every social innovation in the world and every social innovation gap vis-a-vis any stakeholder. And we think that's where all of this becomes feasible. We're working on the concept of, if you've looked at, you've heard of the term reinsurers or retrocessionaires?
Yeah, reinsurer, yes.
Retrocessionaires are the ones who buy the risk from the reinsurers. So
okay.
They're the last step of the third. Yeah, insurers, reinsurers, retrocessionaires. So what we have identified is there's $100 trillion a year of insurance industry being securitized approximately globally. And of that, 0% is prevention oriented. 0% of the derivatives market for insurance includes the prevention of the risk. They're all just investing the resources to save when the risk happens. They're not actually looking at how to reduce the risk, whether it's California forest fires or flooding in Florida or health risk in any part of the world. Really, the risks are preventable through social innovation. And so, we're connecting that together to say, there needs to become in the future a prevention derivatives market in which social innovations can flow to where they prevent harm across stakeholder categories. And that's something that is missing as a structural innovation. So in each of these cases, there's a social innovation thesis in terms of what is the underutilized capacity in the world. In the case of prevention derivatives, it's underutilized opportunity to prevent harm. In the case of zero subsidy affordable housing, it's that you can have people buy a fraction of the appreciation value. We've conflated appreciation value and use value of assets. And if you let people buy a quarter of a house or a half a house in terms of the future sale price, but the whole right to live in it, then it actually has worked for every Stanford professor for 60 years. And we think it could work for lots of other categories of people. And that's an example where underutilized capacity is that we haven't fractured a financial model that has broken people, and that there's an opportunity to do differently. Solidarity economics is where the externalities of doing good pay for themselves for shared value calculations for every stakeholder. And if we look at the solidarity economics potential of social innovations, it's saying where are there stakeholders who should pull the social innovation into where it's needed through collaboration, rather than just social innovation as push, where the social entrepreneur is the only one trying to put it everywhere.
Yeah, that's great. And if we go back to the micro leadership model, what are the main challenges that you currently see, and what are the key success factors that you would say are most relevant?
And if possible, contextualize just a little more the concept, of micro leadership.
So, if you have a human that takes responsibility it can be a wonderful thing and it can be a painful thing. And so I'll explain that by way of an example. There's a volunteer of ours who had been serving food at a soup kitchen context and as a donor volunteer, and had always seen the line longer than they could ever reach every day. And every day had said that they had been growing depressed, finding that the problems were always larger than themselves. And that's partially because we don't have a clear cultural line for how an individual takes responsibility without that responsibility overwhelming them, overwhelming their ability to give, overwhelming their emotions, overwhelming them to the point where they're not able to have agency. And that's because the problems are generally pretty big. Now, in social innovation, we have the luxury and we have a different burden. The luxury is that the social innovation in theory could reach the scale of the problem. They don't get depressed just because they're never going to reach the end of the soup line. In theory, the social innovation could solve the problem. But we have the other problem, which is social innovation scope creep. Social innovation is something that inherently can swallow a human. If, as a macro leader, we see social enterprise burnout as a real thing. There's a book written about a social circle that, and a friend who, Ilya Zinomirsky, who passed away in 2011, More Awesome Than Money, and that's about macro leader burnout, effectively. Macro leaders, he was an amazing social entrepreneur who founded an open source social network for protecting privacy globally, and there was, such burden of all the pressure of all the stakeholders who had donated from crowdfunding that said, why haven't you solved our problem fast enough? And that it was part of his burnout narrative. And I think that what we really need is not the burden of all the stakeholders effectively saying, why haven't all the change makers solved all the problems fast enough, but giving them a way to take on a role, but not a role that scares them. In other words, those were people who took on the role of donating and then sending frustrated mail for the next 5 years. I think in the case of what we're identifying is that we need to shrink what is a meaningful role in transformational participation to the scale that someone can adopt a dimension of a social innovation gap and a dimension of a social innovation development responsibility without taking on the whole. And that's a way to say that we don't want to have. I'm getting feedback noise. Are you getting?
Yeah. Somebody's not on mute. Are you on mute?
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay.
Oh, good. Sorry.
Thank you.
Just a dimension of a social innovation gap that's how it becomes palatable, because people have obligations to self, family, friends, community, many other obligations in life. If they're going to take on a responsibility that connects them to self-awareness of all the challenges in the world, some people don't watch the news because it's too painful. Some people don't watch, don't participate in anything to contribute to good because it's too painful to think about all of the level of gap and how, individually in a day, you're never going to address the global gap. There's always going to be more many people think. But if you give them a leadership role that harnesses their creativity and allows them to adopt a dimension of a social challenge that overlaps with their learning goals and their impact intentions and their creative goals and their creative agency, then they can develop that into a long-term role that is something that can be a source of pride and a source of task-based confidence and a source of context for them. So macro leadership is taking responsibility for an organization or institution. Leadership, when people hear it without micro, they default to a macro-ish or mini macro or whatever, like a board of directors level stress. And the point is that if a person is stressing about the whole of an institution, it's difficult because of all of that interdisciplinary, that the fracturing of the fields, the 100 fields that they need. They don't have all the fields, and so basically that creates anxiety if they try to get a bird's eye view of the whole thing, unless they're a polymath or someone who's radically interdisciplinary, in which case they have confidence across a variety of fields. But most people find it easier to learn one field at a time or learn 3 fields at a time, but not to learn 50 fields at a time. And that challenge is why we structure micro leadership so that that we define failure of micro leadership as if they end up taking on anxieties of the whole organization's ability to execute on a timeline as though it was a macro leadership role. And we have people sometimes leave because they find themselves unable to take on micro leadership. They start worrying about every macro leadership meta, and that gets in the way. But what we find is for people um, who can worry about the part of it they're connected to, and not automatically become a macro leader. We're culturally normed to macro leadership, so it's something that people have to learn away. We're trained to have a centralized view of what leadership is, and really, the way in which Stephen Weber's version of micro leadership that we've been practicing here now 4 years in various iterations and changes of it, but I mean, is giving an individual a lane to run with, and giving them social cohesion um, with diverse others, where they can connect to the macro leadership gap or the social innovation gap. So try to use live containers to address people's anxiety about the um, gaps that they're not expert on, and try to use asynchronous containers to let them run with the parts that they're intradisciplinary, have mastery of, and or in pairs service learn around.
That's great. That's great. Very good. And one thought I had, Bobby, how do you cope with, or how do you deal with individual contribution in terms of let's say your model of micro leadership versus coping with organizations? Because when we talk about open innovation, also we have startups, we have government, we have other institutions. So those are organizations and not really individuals. So in your model, how do you integrate all those organizations in a collaborative way?
Well, I think that there's um, different resources that exist by different institutions. There's been a rise in Western Europe of in-kind venture capital, of media companies investing $5 or $10 million of in-kind resources into a series of startups in the non-impact field. We see in-kind resources as ways to connect institutions into collaboration. We see the prevention of their risk as a way to connect them into the capital stack for systemic change. We also see their impact goals disconnected from their learning goals. We've talked to a number of large companies where their service impact group, their CSR team, has never collaborated with their training team, and never met their training team. And we find this fascinating, because we think that the training goals of an organization could best be achieved through service learning in support of social innovation. For all of the institutions we've met, they have people who don't have certain categories of skill that are best developed. It was interesting when I went to Points of Light conference. There was a major financial institution CSR program who said that they have spread skilled volunteering with the goal of spreading the skill of navigating ambiguity, which is a really interesting way to say that, the ambiguity of having agency within a context. And I think in that institution, they haven't fully shifted into a social enterprise frame. So I think that there is an ambiguity that exists. But I think that in general, we see social innovation, service learning, volunteerism as a gateway to shifting the mindset of people inside institutions in order to then discover shared value business model alternatives, or shared value social innovation alternatives. But I think you were talking about the social innovation replication context, that micro leadership is partially about the saying, what is the issue that we're addressing in general vis-a-vis the world? There's a general problem, and then there's a context or container to proof of concept that solution. And so there's a lot of our initiatives where we say, okay, this could happen, prevention derivatives could happen for the California forest fires or Florida flooding. And, we're not saying it has to be one or the other, or we've even got other alternative places that it could land. So I think the distinction between what is the context for proof of concept of a social innovation is important. Now, I don't know if you all saw, there's been a definition change in the definition of risk that has happened over the last 10 years. And this has been really relevant to social innovation theory globally, because all of the global risk managers, the Global Association of Risk Management Professionals, changed the definition of risk. And a major city in the Bay Area risk officer was telling me about how they had to change the definition of risk or else they wouldn't be able to get bonding. This was 6 years ago, 2000, about 6 years ago now. And he said that before that, they could have said, what is the downside risk only? What is the negative risk only? And the change of policy was that every risk has to be looked at from a positive risk point of view and a negative risk. What is the potential upside to the community if we do this? What is the opportunity cost? What is the opportunity lost if we don't do this? And what is the downside?
Yeah,
And
that's interesting. The risk of losing a great opportunity. So that's the positive side of risk.
And it turns out in his words, every institution on the planet has had to change because all the risk managers have changed the definition of risk, but no one told the other fields. And so I see that as a generalized global opportunity for social innovation gaps to be inviting multi-institutional potlucks of collaboration with in-kind resources, in-kind capacities, and in-kind collaboration. I think those become outcome clusters aligned to social innovation clusters aligned to collective interests. And we can see that at a macro level, we can see that at a micro level. If you look at the WISIP data, it would allow, there was a person I met last week who's tutored 100 kids to read at third grade level. None of them, she said, would have gotten there without her help, because she was working in a community of low resources. And so she said she was proud about that, but she didn't know what the consequences of it would be. And I indicated that, there were 5 families who will not be homeless in 2050 because of her efforts. And she said, really? How do you know? And I said, well, statistically speaking, we can say that. And so there's this synchronicity of saying, what are all of the outcomes of outcomes of outcomes? What are the cascading causes of effect and consequence?
Yeah,
and we actually,
the wave effect.
and we actually could all become superheroes every day vis-a-vis 100-year future history if we see the statistical impact potential of gains vis-a-vis their consequence cascades in ways sufficient for us to motivate ourselves from a narrative and a social innovation collaboration point of view. And I think that that's a part of impact potential that I would love for CSR to strengthen around, to then get credit for supporting all the social innovations of the world, to then say, okay, yes, here are ways in which that we can scale them. Because right now I think that it's too much about too much of the social innovation movement is about retrospective validation of outcomes rather than the impact potential of compound leverage for impact, compound leverage of underutilized capacities in the world for impact. That's where you have leverage enough to attract the inspiration of volunteers to collaborate, because that's where that's where you can solve the problems at radically greater efficiencies that have been possible in the past.
Yeah, that's amazing, Bobby. And in that perspective, changing the paradigm from scarcity into potential, how do you see that model also to help create new entrepreneur like income models? Because maybe some of your projects, they become spin-offs, and they create new businesses, even if they have like social impact focus. So they are with a social impact at their core, but then they also generate a lot of value, to economic value. So how do you see those models to help people understand and promote this potential they have instead of the scarcity, and creating additional value to society? So
well, I think
based
that
on
part of
micro
that
leadership.
is yeah. I mean, I think there's different threads. Or one thread is we think that there's always going to be a room for volunteerism itself, which is not the part that is aimed to be individually, personally, economically remunerative. You are theoretically allowed under U.S. law to compensate volunteers with in-kind resources or payback for expenses up to 19% of the economic value of their volunteer time with a lot of paperwork. But it's basically, you know, volunteerism should not be the frame for economically earning a living. But there are other forms of collaboration that we think could be. I would say it from the perspective of, you know, Gersten Lehrman, for example. You know, this is a million fancy experts offered to fancy companies at high expensive rates for non-impact work. So think about, you know, that there's a library of talent in the world, and then there's a question of what is needed at what time, in what sequence. And, you know, there's no reason why large institutions can't collaborate with social enterprise on impact generating things, and social innovations and social enterprises can't build impact generating products. But in order to get all of these processes to scale, we think that people need to be able to support social enterprises with the same diversification of effort that venture capitalists get. If you're a venture capitalist and you invest in 20 startups and one of them or two of them works, then you get the return from that. And we think that what's broken in regards to the part that you just mentioned in the innovation sector is 96 to 98% of angel employees. Do you have that term in Brazil? Angel employees? Do you know this term? Sweat equity employees, you might say.
For just for angel capital, but not for employees.
Yeah. So there's a term, sweat equity or angel employee, which is people who work and earn stock in a company, and they don't get paid cash; they get stock.
Okay.
And that is a thing that is wonderful in theory, and the problem has been 96 to 98% of it ends up getting forfeited. And the challenge is that unless a company goes public, it's the math ends up being very alien for anyone to be able to collect it. And so it's what needs to happen is there needs to be ways for angel employees to offer their services to a series of companies, a series of social enterprises, in my view, and then connect that to fund structures that can give them diversification and liquidity and be able to eat along the way. And that would allow millions of people to work for social enterprises through the principle of accretion, dilution, and stock swapping that you can have in holding companies, or more narrowly in the principle of equity-based line of credit for social enterprise development. And effectively what we have is a lack of liquidity in the talent pool connected to the impact potential of what's possible. And so the fund structures are broken because we haven't set up meta structures that allow many funds to reuse enough of the same structures and templates and people and processes to be cost effective to create a fund for each region for social innovation replication, or a fund for a theme for a country or a continent. And these impact gaps are things that are structurally addressable. We think that Project Tether, in projecttether.scot, if you Google it, is a group that's creating a global impact finance ecosystem that we're partnered with, and we think that they have a lot of potential. Tomas was head of Social Stock Exchange previously and founded E-Trade UK and founded Interact Investor, which had 400 plus approximately journalists covering the finance ecosystem of public companies. So he's got, I think, the ability to potentially help these impact funds to form. And I think that the potential is to say, how do we get 1,000 people to be able to instantly become an impact fund if they all pledge a certain amount of time and get a financial stake in it? Because right now we can do that with volunteers, but the fund creation infrastructure is not set up so that 1,000 people can can become owners of a fund easily. And we think that's something that's possible. We also think likewise that democratizing investment banking for social change is possible. So we've found Series 82 is a buried law that since the 1950s, you've been able to have someone become an investment banker in less than 50 hours after they've been nominated by a broker dealer. And that's something that we think we can potentially get hundreds of social entrepreneurs to become part-time investment bankers, 5% time investment bankers. And we've been having some excellent collaborative connection to a larger network of social innovators that were open to overlapping their network with that concept too. So in addition to our own ecosystem of it. So I think that there's an interesting way to say, how do we give people roles? Micro leadership is about giving them new roles. So whether they're becoming a part-time investment banker or giving 5% of their time to an investment company that gets them shares as a role, we think that's also an honorable role if people need to earn a living, and if we can do that in the right way at the right stage. We think that there's roles of someone at a company who's a champion of systemic change and of addressing the social innovation gap, because they connect the training department and the CSR department of a company together with us, and we then have them overlap all those goals together in a way that shifts the mindset of that institution. So micro leadership is about that micro leadership role diversification gap. There's, if you think about every NGO in the world and say there's 2 orders of magnitude more roles needed than they've already created for their social innovation gap or their aspiration gap, and then you do the same for social enterprise and say every social enterprise that could hybridize with the NGO sector in order to create a micro social movement proportionate to their social innovation's impact potential, that that ought to be facilitated too.
Yeah, great. And how do you cope with, based on your experience in the long term, to sustain the turnover regarding, because we're talking about people capital, and then when we have opening organizations such as Open Innovation Movement or a foundation with a lot of projects, how do you cope with this turnover, and to make sure that you retain the knowledge, focus on the purpose, and create the impact on the long term?
Well, so I'll give an explanation by way of example. So we've had the last 6 weeks has been an interesting 6 weeks. Our landlord 6 weeks ago said they had to move into our old place, and we had to find a new place to live. We did find a new place. We moved, and then I went to a big conference, and so I had done less to cultivate one of the teams that I normally would have done, and the team started to fall into threshold risk of loss of critical mass. And you need a group of people gathering over a period of time with shared intentionality to really, make progress. And I started to worry about that team after it wasn't short just one meeting; it was short, 3 or 4 meetings in a row that people weren't showing up as usual, and it's because I had been not as available as usual to support that team, and we're still at a scale where some of that support is needed. So the explanation that I'm giving is what I did then to regroup and get to critical mass of team, which is, I think, the relevant tactical point, which is that then I identified all of the people in the past who've applied to collaborate with the team, and I reached back out to them in both. If I had reached out to them previously by email, I reached out to them by LinkedIn. If I had reached out to them by LinkedIn, I reached out to them by text. I, reached out to more than 100 of the people who had applied in the past but hadn't ever started. So people who had come, helped us for 3 or 6 months and left, a few of them too, but I didn't reach out to them because they know what they're getting in for. But people who never started, just didn't quite connect at the beginning. It's, they had intended to volunteer once with it. And so I reached back out to them, and that's, then led to 8 different people from that group of 100 people, reconnecting to this team. and offering to help over the next 3 months. And I've had conversations with each of them one by one over the course of this week and scheduled for next week to connect these people to that team. And then I took all the roles that we had described for that team and I reassessed what are all the other roles that these could be fractured into, what are the other ways to describe it. And I took the welcome materials that we'd been building up and I created a better way for people to learn about the roles, and then I fractured the roles, and we created another 24 roles approximately on that project, and we posted those and then shared those to overlapping interest groups. For that project, I'd over the last 18 months joined social media groups on Facebook and LinkedIn related to it, and shared the new roles to those channels, and then that got another wave of people to apply to join. And basically, if you talk to enough of the people to get back to critical mass, then once you're at critical mass, everybody stays, everybody loves it, everybody keeps hanging out, everybody keeps collaborating. But whenever you're below a risk of critical mass per social innovation, you risk everyone running out and not staying with. So I also want to be sensitive that I haven't given Alexander enough chance to share about open innovation. I wanted to apologize that I haven't turned the questions back around on him, but I suppose since he is video recording, he may have felt that he had participated already in that way. But Alexander, I wanted to actually give you a chance to have voice and not merely technical participation, but I would love to learn more about open innovation, and if any of what I shared resonates or overlaps with your universe of the way you've been thinking about some of these challenges.
It's very interesting. Very interesting. It's very interesting to see that we have very similar challenges and everything, similar realities. And one thing that just crossed my mind now is that I would like to check even with Elio. I think it would be a very great opportunity to connect you, Bobby, with our inside of Vale. We have Fundo Vale, and they are thinking about creating a specific fund for social and environmental impact. And they are thinking about models and what, because just to give you a little historical information, even though they are called a fund, they have never been an actual investment fund. They have only worked with a gigantic donations for non-governmental organizations with environmental impact. And now they are realizing that if they become a real social fund and they invest in social innovation, environmental and social impact, they can potentialize even more their impact. But they're discussing about the models and how to do this and so on. And just to mention a little detail, one of the models would be to use our private retirement funds that we have inside of the company. So we could direct part of our private retirement fund to social and environmental impact. So if, of course,
Well, and the way I would describe that, if you want to leverage the mix of CSR with that, just to riff on that for a moment, is, you have a CSR capability and you have a pension fund. The volunteer time that exists from a CSR process can be invested in kind at a different part of the capital stack than the pension fund. And so you can use the volunteer time to offer a guarantee to the pension fund's economics, which then allows the pension fund assets to be then applied to higher risk social innovation through a so-called natural guarantee, because you have the volunteer time in a capital stack taking on risk because the companies usually don't get anything for the volunteer time. So they can put that at risk in order to protect the pension resource, which is precious, scarce, and important. But then that allows the investments to go into higher risk social innovation by having both of those flows come together that way.
Exactly. Then you balance the wallet, let's call it. Very interesting. Very interesting. If you allow us, I will, as we are recording this session today, I will share this with the Valley Fund, and then maybe connect you guys and see if you could be kind enough to have another session specifically with them. That would
I would be
be
happy to.
great. But that would be a specific different scope. I just saw this opportunity. I didn't want to miss
Sure.
this opportunity.
Life is an
It's a great idea.
improvisation, and bridging social capital is important, as well as, I would say, the bonding social capital of discovering shared language. But it sounds like, does the language that I spoke of, the way I was speaking around social innovation, does it translate into a Brazil social innovation, open social innovation context? I realize that we sometimes pretend that a Silicon Valley language is a global language, and it is not. And I'm not even saying that the Silicon Valley language is a systems change community language, and that's even less global than Silicon Valley language. So in that spirit, I just wanted to triangulate and make sure that this the framings are ones that can exist in a global consciousness.
Yeah, for sure, Bobby. For sure, you gave us a lot of insights, especially how to
Yeah.
manage and leverage the movement or community and social impact. The context is might be totally different, especially on the challenges we have in the country, even for the basic things, not only resources, but the capital, um, human capital for education in terms of basic education as well. So the challenges are maybe in different perspective, but the way to leverage would be very similar. And just concerning about the time, I would like to check if Ivis Rocha has any questions as well to take the chance. Ivis,
I have a lot of them, but then first I will need to organize the things because you have Bob, you had me a lot of new insights, and then probably I will ask Elio or you yourself to have a further conversation
I'd
later.
welcome that. Maybe if y'all are around next week, I'm around. I'm not traveling for the U.S. holiday, so if y'all feel like continuing any of this conversation next week, happy to continue, or another time of convenience if that's not good.
So great,
great.
great. But as Alexander said, we have almost the same challenge here about how to get the people on the micro leadership roles and on a company as huge as Vale, this is really a challenge. And for the social investment, that our role of Vale Foundation role is also a new one. We are starting a new
Well, I would
movement.
say that you can have the intersection of those be a wonderful opportunity, because if someone can take on a succession of 5 or 10 transformational impact roles in their evening, weekends, or CSR role and frame, then that is uh, task competency at role shifting into micro leadership opportunities across work and their day jobs. So these can be synergistic in theory, and we think there's early evidence that in practice they can be synergistic in at least every institution we've gotten to talk into depth about it with. We think that we haven't yet met one that doesn't connect in theory to the service goals. The impact goals can overlap with their training goals.
Yes, yes,
Perfect.
for sure. Perfect. Thank you.
I welcome that. And Helio, I'm very grateful that you brought us together for a conversation here today. And if you are recording as a video, please share me the video so I can
Well,
share for CrowdDoing purposes too, if that's appropriate and comfortable.
For
of
sure.
course, of course, of course.
Sure. And
I will use maybe WeTransfer or any kind of link like this to share with you the video.
yeah.
That would be excellent.
And thank
Perfect.
you so much, Bobby. That was really great pleasure to have you here with us and share your deep experience on that crowd doing and micro leadership.
So
And
many insights, so many
yeah,
insights. Yes.
it's really nice. And we'll share more about the foundation, about the open innovation, and then we can possibly see other opportunities of collaboration
I
in the real
welcome it.
world. Yes, and maybe you also could come down to Brazil to visit us.
I've never
And
been
Brazil.
to I've never been to Brazil, so that
really,
would be fun.
so it's a
My
the,
dad has traveled many times for work to Brazil, but I've never been, so I would love to someday.
yeah, we
Perfect.
have regular open innovation meetings where all the large organization, all the ecosystem of innovation Brazil gets together. So when it's appropriate for you, you can even come to give a talk there and share more your experience publicly.
That would be
Then we
That
great.
would be
can,
amazing.
yeah,
Yeah.
I'd welcome that, and that
all
would be
right.
very exciting. And I believe that social innovation needs to be a global community of practice, a global networked improvement community, and a collaboration for systemic change that crosses regional boundaries. And that bridge was begun in this context today in a way that I'm grateful for. And I'd like to express appreciation for y'all's vantage points today, and looking forward to learning more of the open innovation history and universe of what you're up to in Brazil. And thank you so much.
Can we set up a time now already, or
Sure.
we can discuss
Yeah.
on the we can discuss
Um,
on the group. We don't need, because I don't want to keep you longer
sure.
than we
I've got
Yeah,
scheduled.
another call starting, but let's
Sure.
coordinate by email, and I'm around all next week, so it should be easy to
Yeah.
find a
perfect.
time.
Just
Thank
to
you
keep
so
you,
much,
just
Bob.
to keep you, thank you. Just to keep in mind, we have September 7th, a meeting in a festival called Hacktown, which I believe would be an amazing opportunity. Just let's discuss this in
Wow.
the future.
Bye.
Happy to learn
Okay.
more. Thank you so much. Take care.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much,
Goodbye.
Bobby.
Thank you very much.
Bye.